Leading up to the new Mortal Kombat movie, I was wondering if this movie will finally break this vicious cycle of these crappy and mishmash video game adaptations or movies that we have gotten so far. And while the movie doesn't necessarily deliver on every front, I found that it took some important steps in how the adaptation of video games into movies can one day look like. And it made me ponder on the question, why can't we get a good video game adaptation movie? To just throw this off out there quickly, I haven't seen either the Sonic movie or either of the two Jumanji movies, so I can't really comment on those, but what I can actually give you is my kind of experience and just thinking about how we should adapt video game franchises or IPs into movies themselves. And we have been getting a ton of video game movies that, to me, and I think to a lot of audiences, lacked any real identity or the identity that the game had, that the movie was based upon. And when I was thinking about making this video, I was thinking about the translation from one medium to another, and I've talked about this topic beforehand with comic books and comic book movies, but I feel like that the term lost in translation really fits perfectly here. As when we're dealing with video game movies, you're basically translating from an interactive medium to a passive medium, which means that you go from giving the player or the consumer the freedom to not giving the player any freedom at all. And of course, when we're talking about movies or the passive experience, the player or the consumer is turned into an observer, if you will, not an active part of the story itself. And in my previous video, I've mentioned Sucker Punch now. Sucker Punch instantly resonated with me in the sense that I felt like that the kind of gamifying of a film or the plot of the movie itself was pretty interesting in a whole, and I didn't necessarily understand why they didn't look into that movie and took inspiration from it. And another important kind of inspiration that popped into my mind was Assassin's Creed Lineage, which was also a really interesting experiment, and I don't think a lot of people know about that specific kind of short movie, but it was an interesting experiment in the sense that they have tried to create Assassin's Creed into a movie, and like that is much better than the actual high budget movie itself, but I don't really want to get into that. But what was really interesting in the kind of past decade with video games is that video games now have the ability, like these AAA or big budget video games, to essentially tell the stories that we see in movies. And of course, a lot of games have been focusing on these very linear and narrative focused experiences. And my main examples would be, in this case, Assassin's Creed, the Uncharted games, The Last of Us, or even God of War, and so on. And what was really funny here is that games tried to mimic the narrative style of movies, while the video game movies wanted to mimic the kind of narrative style of the games themselves. And of course, one actually worked, the other one didn't necessarily do that. And one of my other more important thoughts in this matter would be that there are kind of these game movies on YouTube where the people who make these things actually take the footage or the cinematics from a certain video game, they put it into a linear timeline so that you would get the story of the game. And they would also include the minimal amount of gameplay that is required to kind of understand the story or to just form a cohesive narrative. And like those game movies, of course, are made for people who don't necessarily want to play or can't really play those games. And I have watched a ton of them actually back 6 or 7 years ago, and they actually work to a good extent, surprisingly, but they don't deliver this 2-hour movie experience, if you will. They last for like 5 or 6 hours on the very least, or 4. And when it comes to those stories are not the video game adaptation movies that we are really thinking about. And with that, YouTube walkthroughs or just playthroughs in general came into my mind as well. And to me, I never really understood the concept of those, in a sense that they are like watching a video game adaptation in a sense, but without actually playing the experience itself. It's kind of like watching somebody else play is not fun in the general of the sense that the fun of the video game is playing the video game itself. Or to me, it's not as much fun as if you play the game itself. I understand that streaming has become, and Twitch has become a huge place for that, and we don't necessarily watch those walkthroughs or playthroughs for the story or the game itself, but for the personality of the streamer, but that's a completely different experience. But I feel like that when we talk about these video game adaptation movies, they really want to preserve the core game mechanics, or they want to preserve this kind of gamification, if you will. But to me, that doesn't really satisfy anybody in particular, because it's like saying, oh hey, it's like the game that you played, but you're not actually playing it because you're basically watching it someone else play it for you. And to me, that's not why I love playing video games and enjoying the story itself, to watch someone else play. But when it comes to these adaptations, I feel like that when it comes to movies in general, what we have to think about is that what is the most important part of the movie. And to me, that always has to be the story of the movie, and everything comes second. But when we're talking about video games, gameplay has to be the king. It has to come first, and then the story comes second. And now with films, of course, the story has to come first, and kind of the game mechanics or the identity has to come second, and you have a bit of a conflict here, or contradiction, if you will. How do you translate something where the importance of these aspects doesn't necessarily line up? And to that, I would say that what we have to do, or what would be a good point to start, is to ground the IP or franchise in the world of film itself. And to me, I always like to think about this as like finding reference points from just other movies that you have watched and enjoyed, as the wheel doesn't necessarily have to be reinvented right off the bat. For example, if you're talking about the upcoming Uncharted movie, I would say that that movie would probably be very, very similar to anything Indiana Jones related that we've gotten. Or when I think about kind of my Mortal Kombat movie, or my ideal of what the next Mortal Kombat movie or the sequel could look like, I would say that fusing the mythological storytelling of something like Lord of the Rings or Man of Steel, combined with this John Wick style action-oriented storytelling, could work actually wonders for that franchise, and could actually create a unique identity for the franchise within the medium of film itself. And when we are talking about something like Assassin's Creed, for example, I would say that Assassin's Creed's reference points would kind of be the Godfather, as when you have played the first, the second, or even Assassin's Creed Brotherhood in a sense, it has this kind of Godfather-like tone with a lot of characters that you have to hunt down. It's this huge conspiracy. But also we would have to combine it with this very personal Star Wars-like hero's journey, if you will. And you could also include this now synonymous with Game of Thrones style, or even 300 style fighting sequences, if you want to go down that route as well. And I remember one of my instructors, when I learned about how to make video games in general, is that he said that it doesn't matter if your initial project starts off as, let's say, a God of War clone, for example. Because what you have to do is you just have to find a certain aspect that you want to double down on, and you have to nail that aspect. And if you have nailed that aspect, that could make your game unique. You have actually given it a certain identity, even though it has started off as a clone of another IP or franchise or video game. It doesn't really matter in the sense if that's your starting reference point, if you will. And when we are just in the vein of talking about Assassin's Creed, if you have read Assassin's Creed The Secret Crusade, and if you're into the franchise, I would highly recommend to read that book, as I was really interested to see how they would translate the first game's really gamified aspects into a completely different medium. And to me, that book is kind of the perfect example of how you can de-gamify a game, if you will, to fit the medium of books. And the story was actually very interesting and captivating in a sense, whereas I know that the game itself is kind of boring and repetitive, but the book wasn't necessarily like that, and that was really surprising to me. And I feel like that when we are about to ground these IPs in another medium, I feel like that a lot of aspects would have to be cut or removed from the IP. And to me, this just kind of signals that the intellectual property or the franchise would basically have to be remade for a completely different medium. Is of course, when we're talking about remakes or remaking a game, the game remakes are really good touching points as well when we are contrasting Resident Evil 2 with the remake, or even Final Fantasy VII's original version to its remake as well. It's basically like doing that, but for movies, if you will. And I've mentioned previously that I thought Mortal Kombat made some important steps into kind of achieving a good video game movie adaptation. And what I think Mortal Kombat did right were mostly the mythological aspects of it, as I felt like that focusing more on those aspects and building an epic story instead of just going from fight to fight would have made a much more compelling narrative and film in general. And I felt like that the movie was even held back by these forced fight and action sequences that, oh, we have to mimic the game, it's like that in the game story, but it doesn't necessarily work when you translate it into a different medium, or the lack of translation into a different medium. And again, I can just only reiterate the fact that when we are talking about movies and when we are talking about a passive medium, to me, story has to come first. But to put everything into a nutshell, I feel like that embracing the rich lore and mythology created in these and for these great video game IPs, and focusing on that aspect as an integral part of a video game adaptation or a video game movie's experience could be the key to successfully translating video games into movies. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you did so, please leave a like and let me know all of your thoughts in the comments down below regarding how would you tackle a video game adaptation of your favorite video game or favorite franchise, and what do you think about the points that I have made in this video. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this one, and I will see you in the next one. And until then, remember to keep it insightful.